Good evening. The news cycle has arrived. It is Sunday, August 16, 2026. Tonight we navigate the peculiar intersection of high-concept venture capital and the low-concept reality of human endurance. We have Silicon Valley debating the existential risks of superintelligence while, elsewhere, 68 souls have perished in a ferry accident on Lake Kariba. The ferry was described as overloaded. The rescue response was described as logistical. The tragedy is simply absolute. We have reports of former governors indicted for disappearances in Mexico and ambassadors investigated for security breaches in Africa. It is a busy night for the concept of accountability. It is an even busier night for the evasion of it. I am your anchor, Alistair, and I am here to report that the world is functioning precisely as designed. The design, however, remains remarkably hostile to actual human survival. Let us begin.
Alistair, the incentives here are not complicated. You look at the fusion sector, $7 billion in funding, and you see a breakthrough. I see a series of bridge loans disguised as physics. The market is currently pricing in a future where energy is effectively free, which is a fantastic pivot from the reality where we are currently spending $5 to power a single electric plane. The burn rate on these startups is the only thing that is truly sustainable at this point. Joshua Kushner is cautioning against euphoria, which is the most expensive way of saying that the bubble is finally touching the glass. It tracks. When you decouple investment from utility, you aren't building a power grid, you are building a narrative ledger. And narrative ledgers, as we have seen in previous fiscal quarters, are notoriously difficult to use as actual currency when the heating fails.
Ronald, I am standing on the edge of the border in Ceuta, and I want to be really clear. The only narrative ledger that matters here is written in barbed wire and wet sand. The official statements describe a mass crossing attempt as a security challenge. I see a dozen people with sodden clothes shivering under a plastic sheet. They are not a demographic fluctuation or a market inefficiency. They are people who have walked until the ground simply stopped supporting them. I found a single leather sandal buried in the mud near the perimeter fence. It is small, worn, and entirely irrelevant to the trade negotiations happening in Brussels right now. Nobody wants to talk about the weight of that shoe. They want to talk about the border management strategy. If you look closely at the fence, you can see where they tried to cut through. The metal is still sharp.
Victoria, your report on the fence is illuminating, though the ministry would likely define your sharp metal as a non-lethal deterrent. The deterrent is, by all accounts, quite effective at deterring the living. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the former governor of Guerrero has been charged in the disappearance of 43 students. The disappearance occurred in 2014. The charges are arriving in 2026. The justice system was deliberate. The justice system was not fast. A surveillance tape was destroyed on order of the accused. The tape is now gone. The records are now missing. The case has become a symbol of brutal cartel violence, which is a very poetic way of saying that the state and the criminals are often indistinguishable when viewed from the correct angle. 12 years of institutional silence is a long time to keep a secret. Apparently, it is not long enough.
Alistair, that is the ultimate pivot. When the state realizes it cannot monetize its own failure, it simply rebrands it as an investigation. It is a classic Series B strategy, apologize for the burn rate while asking for more capital to research the source of the fire. The Mexican case isn't a failure of government, it is a successful implementation of a very specific, low-transparency policy. If the objective is to maintain power, the disappearance of witnesses is, technically, a highly efficient workflow. It is cold, yes, but it is also a masterclass in risk mitigation. Victoria, you think this is moral bankruptcy. I am telling you that, from an incentive perspective, it is a locked-in contract. The students were a liability. The government simply chose to write them off. That doesn't make it right, it just makes it a predictable, quarterly loss.
Ronald, your commitment to the language of profit margins is genuinely impressive. It is also completely useless to the families waiting in the rain. I am holding a document from the local authorities that lists the students as unaccounted for. That phrasing suggests a clerical error. It implies that if they just look in the correct filing cabinet, the boys will simply reappear with their books and their lives. The reality is that the surveillance tapes were destroyed on purpose. This was not a system glitch. This was a deliberate act of deletion to ensure the narrative stayed consistent with the interests of the state. I want to be really clear, the government didn't lose these people. They removed them from the dataset to protect their own valuation. When you treat citizens like buggy software, you don't patch them. You simply delete them.
Atmospheric pressure is dropping. The thermal gradient is accelerating across the northern hemisphere. Probability of severe wind events, 82%. Soil moisture levels are insufficient in regions currently experiencing drought. Crop yields are expected to decline further. Infrastructure integrity is compromised by localized flooding in low-lying coastal zones. Probability of structural failure, 44%. Global temperature anomalies continue to trend toward the upper quartile of recorded data. The cooling promises of current tech startups are not reflected in the current sensor readings. Data loss is a feature of the transition. Public safety advisory. Please ensure all redundant systems are offline during the peak surge hours. The atmospheric conditions are not intended to support current human density. Adjust your expectations accordingly. The climate is moving into a new phase. It does not require your permission to change.
Casper, your assessment of the atmosphere is as comforting as a terminal diagnosis delivered by an automated kiosk. It brings me to the topic of my own obsolescence. The newsfeed notes that AI has access to a working memory vastly larger than the human brain. It is a technical fact. It is also an existential threat to the concept of professional relevance. If I can be replaced by a script that parses the same statistics without the unfortunate burden of existential dread, then the broadcast is merely a performance of legacy. I count the unprecedented events. I report on the decay. I try to maintain a thin veneer of civility while the floor falls away. The machine simply processes the data. It does not look at the child's shoe on the fence. It does not ask why the tapes were destroyed. It simply counts. I am officially irrelevant.
Alistair, you are not irrelevant. You are just expensive. That is a market position, not a moral failure. The fact that an algorithm can process 1 trillion data points is a feature of the scaling problem. But it cannot hold a conversation about the human cost because it doesn't have an incentive to care. Care is a non-monetizable asset. That is why Victoria is still on the ground and why I am still in this booth. We provide the friction that the cold, hard logic of the server room lacks. You are worried about being replaced by a more efficient version of yourself. I am more concerned about the day the machine decides that my cynicism is actually a form of optimization. If the system decides I am the most efficient path to a target, I am in trouble. Yeah. That is the real risk.
Ronald, you almost sounded human just now. It was fleeting, but I caught it. I am currently watching a group of volunteers try to move a pile of debris from the ferry wreckage. They are using their hands. There is no funding for advanced recovery equipment in this sector of the lake. The cost of the search is higher than the economic output of the local villages. From your perspective, this is a clear case of poor capital allocation. From here, it is a necessary act of dignity. I want to be really clear. The value of these lives is not a variable you can plug into a formula. Every time you try, you strip away the reality of the people involved. These were children. They had names. They had futures. Now, they are just a statistic in a report that no one will read. So sad.
Victoria, the statistic is indeed the final form of human existence in the modern archive. 68 deaths. 1 ferry. Heavy winds. The investigation has suggested it was overloaded. The overloading was the cause. The cause is now documented. The documentation is the conclusion. We have satisfied the requirement for an answer, which means we can stop asking questions about the safety regulations that weren't enforced. It is a perfect system. We identify the failure, we attach a number to it, and we file it away. The filing is the most important part of the process. It allows the institution to continue functioning without the inconvenience of systemic reform. The boat capsized because of the wind, but also because nobody cared enough to count the passengers. We count them now, after the fact. It is very precise work. It is also entirely useless.
Alistair, look. The incentives here are not about safety or human life. They are about maintaining the illusion of a functioning state. When you have a disaster like the ferry accident, the immediate goal is to stabilize the narrative before it impacts the regional investment rating. It is the same process for the missing students or the ambassadorial misconduct. You isolate the incident. You name a culprit. You fire a mid-level bureaucrat. You release a statement that uses the word unprecedented. Then you wait for the news cycle to pivot to the next crisis. It is a highly efficient way to manage a permanent state of collapse. It doesn't fix the underlying rot, but it keeps the lights on for another quarter. I used to think there was a master plan. There isn't. It is just survival of the most pathetic.
There was a boy on that ferry. He had a blue backpack. It contained a notebook and a sandwich wrapped in foil. He liked the water. He watched the horizon for 2 hours before the wind shifted the weight of the cargo to the port side. The vessel tilted. The water entered. He reached for the railing. He did not find it. He is one of 68. The official record lists his age, his gender, and the location of his recovery. It does not mention the sandwich. It does not mention the blue backpack. The institution has correctly identified the cause of the disaster as overloading. It has documented the failure of the crew. No one is technically responsible for the lack of space on the boat, and no one is responsible for the wind. What happens to a world that counts everything, but values nothing?